Hello, welcome to my podcast called Straight Gas, where I talk about my own opinions about cars. When my professor went up to me with the Modal project, I was intrigued because she gave us no real exact topic to choose. So I thought to myself, what's something I really care for? What's something that, talks to me a lot in life? And it's a simple answer, which is cars. Growing up, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, my dad worked for a trucking company. And there was this one red truck I remember named, what was the guy's name? Jose. He had this big red F-150, and I remember it still. And I feel like that started what my obsession today is for. But to really understand what cars are and why we love them so much, we have to start all the way from the very back. And when we look at the very first car, most people think it was a Model T, which in fact was not the first car, but the first mass-produced car. Mercedes-Benz, also back then known as Benz Patent Motor Car, was owned by a dude named Carl Benz. Carl Benz originally was thinking about how he wanted to make a mode of transportation that runs on fuel. He called this the Model 1. The Model 1, back in the day, was a 2-cylinder, 0.75 horsepower car, and it was 3 wheels, 2 in the back, 1 in the front. About only 25 of them were made in total. He applied for this, back in the day, not as a car, but the patent was described as the vehicle powered by a gas engine. And that patent number was 37435. A lot of historians say that that patent and that car was the birth of what we have today in automobiles. Carl Benz came up with a lot of technology as well. From the manufacturing, steering systems, those were really hard to do back in the day because they didn't understand how to pivot it correctly. And then, which all was patented in 1893. And then the first car he made using this steering technology and trying to mass produce it was called the Model Victoria in 1893, which got a couple of upgrades from the last one, including the double pivot steering system and higher horsepower numbers. With that came his first world production car called the Benz Velo in 1984, a lightweight, durable, and less expensive than the originals. 1897, he developed this thing called the twin engine, consisting of 2 cylinders that were in parallel, not like the V shapes or the straight shapes that we have today. However, this would not work well since it was changed later on to the newer idea of contra engines because the cylinders were arranged opposite of each other, which helped with the horsepower and made up to 16 horsepower, and it was used in the early 1900s. Now, everybody thinks Ford was the first one. Ford, in fact, did not make the first car, but they did make the first mass-produced car. The Model T, which came out in 1908, was the first mass-produced car of its numbers. It ranged anywhere from $260 to $850, depending on costs of parts and the options you would want, which were very limited back in the day. From 1908 to 1927, over 15 million of Model Ts were built. And some fun fact, back in the day, Henry Ford had this one quote for his cars: any customer can have any car painted in any color they want, as long as it was black. Back then, to make it cheaper, to make it quicker, they only offered black paint. But later on in 1925, they did introduce more colors. Main topic, what makes cars go, pretty simple, but kind of complicated. I could get into the technical terms such as timing, head gaskets, valve covers, valves, springs, but the simplest way to understand how an engine works is to understand combustion inside of an engine. To have combustion, you need 3 things to happen. You need spark, you need air, and you need fuel. All 3 of these are constantly put into the engine and compressed at really high pressure that causes combustion, which causes the engine to move. But thinking to yourself, why are some cars faster? Why are some cars slower? Why are some cars diesels? Why are some cars just normal petroleum? And the main thing is basically just price. When looking at an engine and looking at a car, you got to understand the manufacturer puts certain engines in certain cars and charges a certain price for them. But what do these different engines mean? Why should you, instead of getting a 6-cylinder, get an 8-cylinder? Why shouldn't you get an 6-cylinder over the 8-cylinder? Big questions. But let's start off with engines. Most common engine at the lowest number of cylinders that we have is a 3-cylinder. A 3-cylinder is used in things such as a Toyota Camry and other smaller cars that don't need much power. That being said, those usually range from only about 110 horsepower. Not much, but enough to move the car. And then we go up, we have the inline 4-cylinders. Those are in the most economy cars today, such as your Lexuses, your Mercedes, your Fords, everything. Almost every brand today has a 4-cylinder in one of their cars because it is pretty cheap to make, pretty reliable in most cases, and does well in day-to-day commutes with still having a little bit of extra horsepower. Most 4-cylinders range from that number about 140 horsepower to 300 horsepower, depending if it has a turbo or if it's tuned higher from the manufacturer. Next up, we have inline 5-cylinders. Inline 5-cylinders are, an inline is basically when all the pistons are in one straight line and the engine will be like this or like this. Those are most commonly used in like Jettas, Audis, and other German cars. 5-cylinders aren't pretty common. Your most common engine for higher spec cars over the base model is a 6-cylinder. The 6-cylinder allows for good power and also good gas mileage. And today, most companies such as like BMW, Mercedes, Ford, they do twin turbo 6-cylinders. But what's a turbo? And what's a supercharger? And why do they matter? Why, when you're searching for a car and it says, oh, it's a twin turbo V8 or it's a twin turbo V6, what does turbo mean? Going back to the 3 things every engine needs: spark, air, and gas. Air. A turbocharger and a supercharger are meant to push more air through the engine, which in fact pushes more horsepower. So, when you have those numbers, oh, it's a twin turbo, it's a single turbo, it's got a supercharger, it's just there to provide more power. And what's the difference between a supercharger and a turbocharger? A supercharger sits on top of the pistons and provides air straight into the engine and uses a pulley system to keep it cranking. On the other hand, turbochargers are pushed through exhaust gas and push air through the engine from exhaust gas, which adds extra power. And then going on to other engines like this car has as a twin turbo V8, we have V10s, we have V12s, we have W12s and W16s. Those 2 engines, Ws, mean that the pistons are not aligned perfectly, but sideways a little bit. They're a little mis-centered. This helps to produce more power, but is more expensive to make. And then we have our W16 using Bugattis and more expensive cars, and just manufactured not too recently a V16, which is pretty cool. Now when we try to understand electric, every car has a battery in them. And they're all a 12 volt. 12 volt is just what everything runs off the power before the alternator gets turned on by the starter turns on the engine and the alternator moves with the engine that makes the power. But electric cars don't have an engine, they don't have an alternator, but they still have this. This will start the motors, it will tell the car to wake up. With like a Tesla, for example, they have thousands and thousands of these small, what look like AA batteries in a big pack at the bottom of the car to help with weight. That's why in rollovers, Teslas are the best because they usually land bottom side up due to how bottom heavy they are. And electric cars have gotten much better since the beginning. It's funny. There's electric cars before we even had gas cars. They tried it with nickel batteries before lithium was a big thing. And with electric cars, you just have motors. Some cars have 4 motors, that's very expensive. Some cars have 1 motor, very cheap. Just depends on how much you spend on the car. And with electric cars, you have instant torque, you can see the range, you have generative braking, which means when you brake, the motors actually spin backwards, which helps send more energy back into the system. Overall, electric cars are cool. But the only problem is today's technology, and with like big pickup trucks such as the Cybertruck and the Rivian R1T, you only get about 350 miles on a full charge, and that's being generous. If you tow, or if it's really cold or really hot, you just keep losing range just like this. And so for now on, hybrids are probably the best system for range because the engine powers the battery and the battery helps move it, which allows you to get much better fuel mileage, such as some hybrids, such as the new Prius, can do up to 54 miles per gallon. And some companies are now trying to do about 70 miles per gallon. Now the big question is, we started with the Ford Model T, the Mercedes Model 1, all these very small, very slow compared to what we have today cars. You know, it's funny, the first speeding ticket ever given was, I'm pretty sure, in Pennsylvania for 8 miles per hour. Speed limit was 5. But today, you know, instead of only producing a couple million cars, we have over a billion. Over a billion. And just in 2023 alone, we produced over 94 million cars all around the globe. And a lot of them still sort of run, still don't. That's why this manufacturing is really bad for the environment. Gas is not great for the environment. You know, they try to do better with hybrids, with electrics, but at the end of the day, somebody got to mine the nickel, somebody got to mine the lithium to put in your car. But what about cars today? Model T, Model 1, they were all very similar shape. And the area that you live in on the world greatly differs what you have. Some models aren't available in certain regions, such as in America. If you want to sell a truck here from a manufacturer, you have to build the truck in America. That's just a rule. But on other things is, we have the 25-year import law stating that you cannot import a car into America unless it is 25 years old. In Canada, it's 15. In Europe, they don't have that law. That was back in the day because Mercedes was getting mad at people shipping in European cars since they were better value, better options for about the same price, maybe sometimes cheaper. But today there are about 10 different types of cars. We have the sports car, hatchbacks, coupes, sedans, convertibles, station wagons, minivans, vans, SUVs, and pickup trucks. The meaning of SUV, by the way, is a sports utility vehicle, which really doesn't mean anything because most SUVs are really either really big, really small, underpowered, overpowered. They're not the best. Sports utility vehicle is kind of misleading. And like a fun fact that I figured out, that a Kia Soul is considered an SUV, but a Kia Soul is only 165 inches long, while a Range Rover 130, a 3-row SUV, is 211 inches long. One weighs over 7,000 pounds, one weighs around 3,000 pounds. Very different sizes, very different motors, but still under the same class. Now, going back to electric cars haven't been big since of recently. It's only about the mid-2000s when we saw a rise of them being more popular. The most notable electric car that kind of sent the industry to look into it at first was a Tesla Roadster. Tesla came out with this in 2008, but didn't put them into production until about 2010. But they weren't a big success since they only had about 150 to 200 miles, very low quantity, a 2-seater, not very practical. But in 2012, they came out with the Tesla Model S, which was a big success. They sold many. It was the first electric car that people were able to see useful, see as a daily car that they can have from themselves. And today, most electric cars have a range anywhere from 200 miles to with what we had with the Lucid Air Sapphire with up to 500 miles. And Tesla Model S claims 500, but it's not exactly that. And electric cars are becoming very popular, as people can tell. Though most companies have backed off. A couple of years earlier, when electric cars were getting really big, companies said by 2030 we will be fully electric. I know Ford said that, Mercedes said that, BMW said that. They all backed off of that statement because electric cars don't sell as well as the gas vehicles, and they don't perform as well in really harsh climates as gas vehicles can. Some notable manufacturers that make fully electric cars today are Lexus, Toyota, BMW, Chevy, Cadillac, and many more. Going back to electric cars, as you can tell through this, they're not my favorite. They have some positives here and there, but overall, they're not as how people make it seem. First of all is range. Some companies show that there's 400, 500, some even now like Lucid and newer companies say they get 600 miles of range. That's if there's optimal conditions. With that, if it's too cold, too hot, the car has to spend time cooling itself and heating itself up if it's too cold outside to make sure that the batteries are in perfect temperature. That process of changing the temperature takes power, which in turn takes range. And so they aren't as they seem. I mean, most car companies say, oh, this car gets 26 miles per gallon. If you floor it, it's going to get less. If you keep revving it, it's going to get less. Yes, but electric cars are more susceptible to more increased amounts of change to range. And another thing is, a lot of people say, hey, we should get electric cars because they're better for the environment, they have no emissions, stuff like that. But the amount of emissions that it takes to mine the lithium and the nickel that is required for electric cars, that's a lot of diesel for those machines. Then to import it, then to process it and make it into batteries, plus making the car takes emissions anyway. So electric car doesn't make itself emissions free unless you drive it, like I think they stated most cars about 170 to 200,000 miles. And after a certain point, the batteries aren't good enough anymore to drive that far. You don't really see many electric cars above 100,000 miles. And the thing is, the electricity that your house gets from the grid most of the time comes from natural resources from the electricity plants. So it's not like that the power you're getting is clean to your clean car. Right now, the best thing we have is hybrids. Hybrids allow for a gas engine that's not very powerful, that doesn't take much fuel, to be more efficient and get higher miles per gallon due to help from the electric motor, which is powered by the engine. Or some are plug-in hybrids, which sort of makes it a little better. There has been some recent technology, though, from companies such as Porsche that they're making biofuel. It is very expensive. Right now, it's about $47 a gallon to use this fuel, but it has almost zero emission. Not sustainable for the average American, but it is a cool technology. If they can make it cheaper, it'll be much better. Another cool technology that is in use right now is hydrogen-powered cars. Hydrogen is cleaner. Again, there's still some emissions. It's cleaner to produce for cars. And when a car uses it, the only thing that comes out of the exhaust is actually just water after it gets through the chemical reaction inside of the engine that it uses. And so, coming off of that, just another personal opinion of mine, SUVs, like I stated earlier, sports utility vehicle, a lot of SUVs these days are either really underpowered or massive. They're not able to be used under the classification sports. So I feel like a lot of companies in these past couple years have been killing off station wagons. Not many are being sold, or they're just not good looking according to the average American. But overall, they have the same amount of power as most SUVs, almost the same amount of room. Of course, an SUV is much bigger. Station wagon is the size of a sedan, but with a larger end. That, in fact, though, is super similar to an SUV. And it's not half the size, but much smaller. Takes up less room, takes up less gas, weighs less. Overall, it's just better. And in today's news, something I found interesting is the tariffs. A lot of companies are from not America. Most companies import their cars from Japan, such as Lexus and Toyota, Germany, such as Mercedes and BMW. And so with the current tariffs, it's 10%. So most companies are going to see an increase in either cost to produce or cost on the consumer. Many companies, such as like Ford, are now giving employee pricing to everyone to help offset these costs. And Mercedes, which is just taking the cost by themselves. So other companies such as BMW are saying we won't increase prices until June 1st or some other date. But after that, we don't know anything. So 10% on a $60,000 car is a couple grand, so it's going to keep going up. But there has been some good news. Lots of companies such as Toyota and BMW are now looking for manufacturing space in United States, which will make that the tariffs won't affect the cars, therefore making it cheaper on the people. And with all of that being said, thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope you enjoyed it.